Hello, everyone, and welcome to CMU CS Academy's CS Interdisciplinary Topics live session today for CSEdWeek. I'm here with everyone, and welcome to CMU CS Academy. Hearing my voice double, but I'm here with Elliot Haney as well as a few of our student team members, so I'll let them introduce themselves before they get started.
Hello, as Aaron said, my name is Elliot Haney. I am the curriculum or content manager, which means that I manage all the courses that we offer. Yeah, I was a student a couple of years ago at CMU, been on the project since it began, so I've been around for a while. Yeah, that's enough about me. James, why don't you go?
Sure. I'm James. I'm a student at Carnegie Mellon, studying computer science. I'm in my junior year, and I've been working with CS Academy for almost a year now. I mostly work on Spanish translation and also have worked on web development.
Hey everybody, I'm Tate. I'm also a student at CMU. I'm a senior studying biological sciences and minoring in computer science. And I've been with CS Academy since my sophomore summer. And I've worked on the web development team during the summers and the teacher outreach team during the school year.
All right, so the topic of today's stream is interdisciplinary disciplinary topics and computer science. So first we should sort of explain what that is. What does it mean for a field or a topic to be interdisciplinary? Do either of James or Tate, do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, I can. So I would say that what makes, I guess the word interdisciplinary, like by itself, kind of means, combining things from different disciplines. So it's kind of an intersection between different fields. Maybe it can be anything. So it could be like math and some kind of science, or it could be math and some kind of like reading or English, if you can find out a creative way to mix things together. But we're talking more specifically about interdisciplinary CS topics. So that refers to ways in which computer science can kind of overlap with regular kinds of science, or with the arts, or with the humanities. And you'd be surprised to find how many different ways computer science can kind of work its way into subjects that might not directly or inherently involve programming or computers.
Thank you, Tate. Okay, so the way we're gonna sort of run this is first we're gonna start by showing off some examples of different applications and sort of just end results of programs that are sort of in interdisciplinary fields. And then we have some questions. If you have questions, you can always ask in the YouTube chat, and we will get to them later on in the stream. But for now, James, do you want to share some of the examples that you?
Sure. So here, let me share my screen. And the first example I have here is from this, he's a very big YouTuber, Mark Rober, who works on a lot of cool and fun engineering projects. And a lot of them do involve computer science and the intersection of, I guess, computer science, engineering and also a lot of creative fields. I found this project specifically really cool. He created a Domino Robot to break the world record in placing dominoes, and also did some cool art at the same time. So I'll go through video, find a good part. So he made this robot that would move around, and it would load dominoes here and then place them all down. And it also had a whole method of loading all these dominoes. I don't know if there's a good point in the video that has a good example. Okay, so here you can see the placing the dominoes, and it places all these dominoes in a tile of 300 at a time. And he eventually created this huge, I guess almost a domino mural of Super Mario Bros. So let me find the, yeah, so here you can see it creating this whole mural, which is really cool. So this robot had to know, like at any time, what dominoes it had to pick up. So it was make sure you're placing the correct colors in the correct places. Then it had to know exactly where to go and then how to place those dominoes. And yeah, so it had a lot of interesting computer science involved. And at the same time, also the engineering of the robot itself and converting, in this case, the artwork here and converting that into, finding a way to translate the image into something that a computer could understand. So I found this to be a really cool interdisciplinary application. It was definitely one that was really creative and not necessarily the most practical one, but something that's really cool and creative. And let's see. So next one is some cool CGI. So if you've watched any movie in the last 10, 20 years, even 30, there's been a huge growth in CGI or computer generated imaging. And so a lot of these movies, right, this example is from the movie Avatar, which came out in 2009. A lot of these movies use computers and computer science to really augment the experience. So in this case, they used, basically they used these bodysuits to track where people were moving and then augment this onto characters. So this is what that movie itself looked like. And here, let me actually go back a bit in this video. If it shows you. So here they have people in suits and a bunch of green screens doing all this movement. So here's an example of like the bodysuit. So they're wearing all these technology that tracks where they are. And then they use algorithms to process it and generate an image like this. So by doing this, they create a very immersive experience in the movie, and it looks very realistic. This movie in specific Avatar was I guess considered revolutionary in this sense because of how much, like how good the CGI was and how realistic it looked. Because everything from the facial expressions to the background in all these movies look very realistic. So here's some other one. So this is a dragon riding one where you can see in real life, right? They're on a bunch of metal. They have a weird black suit, and then they turn it into this image on the right, which I think is quite remarkable, given what they start with. And that's all through computer science and other processing techniques. So get to the next one. Okay. So next I have, actually this comes from Carnegie Mellon itself and from the robotics department at CMU. So they worked on a lot of cool interdisciplinary projects. And this is really kind of an intersection of computer science, mechanical engineering, and also biology. So they have a whole section at CMU, the biorobotics lab, that looks to create robots or use actual biology as an inspiration for robotics. So in this case, this is a snake robot. And these are actually really useful robots. They can wrap around trees and they can get into really hard to reach places. So in this case, they're using the robot to explore a nuclear power plant. And this is something that's really interesting, I think, and I think it's really cool to see something. It's, it looks and it moves like a snake, except it can be controlled. I think this video might show a bit more about it. So yeah, here they have the robot going through tubes that they otherwise wouldn't be able to access. So yeah, they considered also using these robots in other situations outside of like just nuclear power plants. So for example, going into disaster areas, right, where let's say after an earthquake, it could be hard to reach certain places in between rubble and all that. But if you have a snake robot that can fit into small gaps, it might make it easier to find survivors and then, readjust efforts to actually help out those survivors. And this is especially cool because of, I guess, how the inspiration comes from real life. So like a lot of people, they look at a snake and look at how that can be mimicked and how the biomechanics of the snake make it a useful tool. Okay.
All right, James, I think we're gonna go to Tate. Tate has a couple
Sure.
non-STEM related examples that we'll get to, and then we can loop back maybe to your last few examples afterwards. Yeah, Tate.
Yeah, so the first example I have, you might be wondering what sort of non-STEM related stuff you might be able to use computer science in. And so one of the examples is actually generative art. So art is something that's seen as very subjective and not super quantitative, but there are ways to make something very artistic that somebody can, observe or maybe even interact with, that has just a more artistic purpose. So if I share my screen real quick, this is actually, it's sort of generative art. I would consider it generative art. It's actually one of the projects for one of the intro programming courses in one of CMU's intro programming courses. And basically it's this completely procedurally generated simulation of going through the woods, just taking a walk through the woods, basically. And everything you see is completely generated on the spot, kind of tries to mimic something that looks realistic, but it strikes me as very artistic because they're, they've got all the trees, everything is this landscape that differs every time you run the program. And I just think it's really cool. So this one was pretty elaborate, and I think probably required, a lot of code and some complicated algorithms, but everything like the trees and the birds flying are all procedurally generated right there on the spot, and it will never look exactly the same anytime that you run it. And so there's actually no direct user interaction with this program. You just run it and you observe it. And so everything is kind of determined on the spot, like when I guess the hermit would be the person that's going and taking the horse with it, but the appearance of wildlife like deer and birds, and when the hermit decides to start walking or stop walking. I think even later there's like hunting animations and stuff too. So this is something that I found to be really interesting. That's an example of generative art. There's lots of other examples as well. I'm sure that if I were to Google something, that I could probably find a lot more examples. There's basically no limit to what kinds of generative art you could create using computer science tools. So I think this is really interesting, and it's even something that we delve into in our CS2 course. If you all are, is that still piloting, or is that open now?
It's technically pilot, but it's available for teachers if they want it.
Okay, gotcha.
They can use it.
I was just curious about that. Yeah, so that's something you can definitely use CS for. That's highly interdisciplinary with two subjects that you wouldn't expect to be directly related necessarily. Yeah, I have something else, but I might need a minute to get it ready. I'm gonna stop sharing for a minute.
Yeah, sure. While Tate is pulling that up, I could talk a little bit about a different application, and that is within music. So there's something called an algo rave, which is basically it's a person who is live coding music while the music is playing. And so they basically put on a concert by simply just coding up a program and letting that program play and play the music. And the reason I bring this up, when it's topical to the discussion, but also we're going to be trying to do that tomorrow in tomorrow's live stream. So if you want to see how that goes, none of us really have that much experience with it. So we'll see, but it'll be fun to try and play around with that and see how that's going to work. Yeah, Tate, did you get it? Should I stall farther?
I think that's enough stalling. There's not actually a video to go with this one, but I think it's something that a lot of people are actually probably familiar with, and that I think is really interesting, and that is speech to text. So if you think about it, whenever you go into something like Google Translate, maybe you say something in English and you want it to translate it and then say it back to you in, I don't know, Spanish, for example. Or maybe you're on your phone and your hands are tied up, but you want to be able to send a text message. You can use speech to text to tell a message to your phone, and your phone will convert it into a text message to send that somebody can read. And so there's definitely a lot of computer science and algorithms that go into that, even though language is seen as more of a humanities subject. I can't really go necessarily into the algorithms that go, or at least not too deeply into the algorithms that you can use to detect language, but there are definitely a variety of different algorithms you can use. And more generally speaking, this generally falls under kind of an umbrella term that's known as NLP, or natural language processing. And so that's a type of, generally it kind of encompasses something called machine learning, which basically uses a lot of math and statistics to model things that we see in real life and tries to make predictions or create new things that kind of resemble whatever we see. So speech to text or text to speech, the model, what the NLP would be trying to do is model, the words that I'm saying right now. If I were telling it to Google Translate, or I guess, speech to text, the software would be trying to model my speech and the speech that it's heard from everybody else in the world that's used it, and try and use that model to determine the words that are actually being said, as well as maybe for the speech to text, trying to produce sounds that are similar to what come out of our mouths whenever we give it some text that it's been trained to recognize, or to be able to convert that into words that it can say to you. So natural language processing and speech texts are definitely super relevant, not directly CS related interdisciplinary topics that I think are really cool. Let's see. Yeah, that's pretty much all I've got on speech to text. Should I proceed with other topics, or do I want to pass it back to you? Or,
I was writing in the chat, and Zoom is weird, and get back to the room to unmute myself. Yeah, okay, so I got a couple examples myself. So I shall share my screen. Actually, let me change Chrome, so you don't see the YouTube chat, because that would just give us a infinite loop of looking at ourselves. So this is the right tab. Okay, so I mentioned the live coding to create some music, and so that's we're going to be using Sonic Pi, which is a it's in the programming language Ruby, and the idea is that they have a very nice tutorial for us. But basically, you can create loops, and you can create samples of, I don't actually know what this instrument is, but you can basically create instruments and have it play every so often. I think this is playing something every half a second. And then you can add like ambient noise, you can add, you can do more complicated stuff where you can add like effects to your audio. So if you want an echo, you can do that. And if you want to play a guitar E minor add 9 chord, I believe that is, you can do that, right? Like, and so this would just keep playing guitar with some kind of echo or reverb or whatever, and it would just keep playing this chord over and over and over again. And then after it had done that, I believe a couple times it goes down here, or no, it also runs this code at the same time, which is I believe this is like a drum, right? So you can kind of see how you can start to code up some music in this way. There are a bunch of really interesting tools to do this with code. But this is a very interesting application of coding, using it as an instrument. And so people are very good at this, painfully good, because, you know, it takes a lot of practice, and it'd be really cool to be able to do that. Yeah, okay, so that's the algo rave stuff that I was talking about. And like I said, we'll be doing a stream where we try and do it ourselves tomorrow. I believe it is at 2 p.m. Eastern time. That might be wrong, 2:30, something like that. Yeah, as Tate said, generative art is a big thing. And he showed a particular example of a CMU student's project, but there's also a lot of other stuff you can do. Like, there's just a bunch of examples here. Some of my more favorite type of stuff is like this, which is this is creating a ball, which is just a bunch of lines connecting around the circumference of a circle with some nice shading. And then it starts to, like, the lines are drawn out here. And it just looks really cool, right? And it would be really hard to make something like this with pen and paper, because you can see the texture of the lines. And that would just be a pain to do manually by hand. And you also get like these really interesting breaks. You can do fractals. And this is one of my favorite examples of this article. I think this is just amazing. And this isn't really that hard to code. Like, you could do this in our framework, in the CMU CS Academy framework. These are just lines that are connected and that split off and go off in somewhat random directions. And then from those lines, you branch off more lines and more lines. And, you know, it's not anything too crazy. Yeah, there's a bunch of different approaches you could use. That's not really exactly a coding example, that last image, but yeah, just a lot of cool things. This is actually a math object that is being visualized in a very artistic way using code. The Mandelbrot Set is very famous looking fractal. Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about art, we've talked about music, we've talked about robotics and language. What about sports? Well, you might see in my tabs that I have something about Madden Predictions. I couldn't find an example, unfortunately. I think they like to keep their code nice and secret, which makes sense. But if you like sports, you probably are aware of the Madden video games about, you know, and the reason Madden is sort of a big name is because Madden, the whole thing is they make predictions about games, like sports events, like the Super Bowl or the college basketball tournament that I'm forgetting exactly what it's called right now. But they make predictions using computer algorithms, and they became very big, and they're generally pretty good at it, which is weird when you consider that those games involve, those sports events involve people and people performing at certain levels and being, there's a lot of random variables of what might happen. Yeah, like being able to make predictions about things is super useful. And I think doing it in sports is really cool. There's also a lot of like analysis that you can have computers do for sports teams. Like someone who worked on this project works for a sports team as a data analyst, and that's their job. They work for a professional NFL team, which is cool, right? Unfortunately, like I said, I don't really have examples. I couldn't find any for this, but it is an application of coding into a non-traditional school topic of sports. And the last one I have, which again, I don't have necessarily very good examples of, but is sort of, I could see applications of this being used for fashion. And so the idea is there are now simulations of a bunch of things, but fabric being one of them, of like really accurate ways that the fabric moves. And so you could imagine something like this. That's exactly what I was looking for, right? You can see how these pieces of clothing are moving as the person is performing these different actions, right? You could imagine that there is a software out there where you can design a piece of clothing, you can put it on some model in the computer program, and that model will like walk, and you could just watch and see how the fabric moves, see if it fits properly, anything along those lines, right? Like this is really could be potentially very useful for you to do sort of advanced planning for your if you're making like clothing, right? Or other things along this line. Okay, so that was all the examples I really wanted to share. Again, I don't have code here. This is a research paper that this video is talking about, which I suppose you could go read if you really wanted to, but I don't actually have the code. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing and then do some questions. Get to my questions. So my first question, I think it's mostly for Tate, but it is, so Tate is a computational biology. It's what he does at CMU. And my question for Tate was, how did you get into that field? Because, you know, it's a little niche.
Yeah, so a lot of the coursework that I do is based in computational biology, or I've taken several computational biology courses because I have a bio major, but I have a strong interest in computer science. And a lot of that kind of evolved as I became a student, or as I kind of progressed as a student at CMU. I had never had the chance to take a CS class before I came here. So I didn't really know if programming was something that I wanted to do, but I came to CMU originally to study biology. I thought I was going to work in a lab for the rest of my life. And I started taking some programming classes and realized I really enjoyed it. And it also happened to be the case that CMU offered some computational biology courses. So after I kind of established that I really liked computer science and programming, I said, okay, well, why don't I take some of these classes? And also one of them is technically required to graduate as a bio student, but that's aside from the point. So I've taken a couple of classes at this point, and they explain algorithmic ways to kind of process biological data because a long time ago, biology was a lot more qualitative, where you might have heard of like Gregor Mendel when he started mixing crossbreeding like different kinds of peas, and some of them would be green, yellow, and some of them wrinkled. There was some numbers and some basic statistics behind that, but as we've been able to get more data, like DNA, for example, where a single human has 6 billion pieces of DNA information in their genome. There's a lot of data to handle, and far more than any human would be able to process. And so computational biology has been really important in being able to take the data that we get from the lab and assembling it into something that actually makes sense. Like, for example, the Human Genome Project, if you've heard of that, where little pieces of DNA were from various experiments were combined using different algorithmic processes, because the reads that you get from the lab are only might only be like 100 pieces of information long, 100 bases, and you have to make them all overlap, and so that they can actually read into the 6 billion bases in a row all together, that we can now use for reference because we have that data now, thanks to algorithms. And a bunch of other stuff as well. There's, at this point, you can model groups of cells, and you can detect different, there's a potential or research in trying to be able to detect cancer just by like taking like a tissue sample and putting it under a microscope and having a computer analyze like a model of what cancerous cells look like versus what regular cells look like. And that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg. There's protein prediction and a bajillion other things that are happening in computational biology. But I guess I kind of got away from Elliot's question a little bit. Basically, I got interested in computer science coming in as a bio student, and there were courses offered specifically in computational biology that I've gotten involved in and that I'm currently taking, and it's lots of fun. And some of those topics that I talked about were things that are discussed in the courses that I'm currently taking, especially the stuff to do with like DNA and genome sequencing and stuff.
Yeah, all of that is very, very interesting. I'm actually currently in the process of making some updates to our genetics section of CS2. So it has been on my mind lately. We do have a question in the chat, so thank you. The question is, does anyone use Sonic Pi, which was the music sort of framework that I brought up on screen? Does anyone use Sonic Pi in actual classrooms? I don't know if either of you feel like you might have an answer. I can answer it not. Well, what I can say is that I'm not aware if Sonic Pi is actually used in like high school classrooms at all. CMU does have courses that are specifically about live coding music. That there's actually one class that I believe does like a performance at the end of this semester, which is very very cool. There's also like I sort of alluded to this, but there are a lot of different libraries and stuff that you can use to do live coding or other types of coding with music. One of them I do know is used a lot in classrooms. It's called Ear Sketch. I think it's more for like learning how to code using music sort of as the primary interactive element. Whereas with us, a lot of our stuff in our courses are like animation based, image based. Your sketch does it more in a music sense. Our framework also has a audio library now, although it's a little hidden if you're not taking CS2. But it does exist, and it will be more available come the next year. Oh, and someone else in the chat says that they did use it in their classroom. So that's cool. Thanks for sharing that. But that it is more of a creative tool. Yeah. There's another question about how much Python does a person need to know in order to be able to create something of interest?
So I think I can field that question. So actually the hoodie that I'm wearing right now is a staff hoodie for the course that I'm currently TAing, which is an intro course at CMU for programming. And it was the second CS course I ever took in my life. And you know, all of the preparations that we do in that course are kind of geared towards giving students enough understanding of Python for them to be able to put together their own interdisciplinary CS projects. So when it comes to like actually putting together different interdisciplinary projects or programs, to an extent, it depends a little bit on how complicated you want the algorithm to be. But if you want something, you know, of interest, as you all put it, I would say that really the basics are all that you need, because the fundamentals are what gets taught in 112, and most of the fundamentals are what gets taught in CS1, and definitely by CS2. By the end of it, you know the vast majority of all of the basics of programming. So I would say, you know, if you're finishing CS1, then, or you're going to finish CS1, then you'd be able to put together some of these projects starting now, or whenever you finish, or whenever you get close to finishing. I'm sure there have been some interdisciplinary final projects even in the final unit of CS1. Sometimes it requires a little bit of research if there's, you know, particular algorithms that you want to implement, or if you need to do a little bit more research into the subject area for the project that you want to make. Like, for example, I wouldn't expect somebody to be able to do like algorithmically generated books or text. You know, that was, yeah, it was a little bit tricky, but not impossible to do with CS1 and CS2. But just as an example, you know, well, I mean, it might not be incredible. I mean, I guess
as far as I'm aware, at least a couple years ago, so things might have changed. But as far as I'm aware, actually doing that in a real way is still sort of an open problem that hasn't been solved. Like, most of the computer generated stories I've read are not exactly masterpieces.
Right. It depends. So it depends on, you know, what level of robustness you want in something that is of interest. I mean, you can do like simple, you know, word frequency models, you know, that basically count up like how many times this word shows up and how many times like this word connected to this word shows up out of like a percentage of all the words in your data. And then use that to generate stories. They're a little bit wonky because it's not a super complicated model, but it is definitely interesting and very entertaining, amusing, and legit, especially as a student. And so, you know, in my book, I would consider that of interest, although I don't know that you would necessarily like, you know, there was somebody who generated like 800,000 books with algorithms, but they're like a professional software engineer, and they sold them, but their algorithms are probably like super complicated. And so there's a difference in the level of algorithmic complexity and robustness, and probably like the quality of what you're going to get out of it. But I think, you know, doing these projects as a high school student, like if you're able to put together, you know, even something that like remotely makes sense with, you know, unigram and bigram, which are like those little word frequency stuff I was talking about earlier, then I think that's extraordinary. and really interesting. And that's just, once again, that's just one example of an interdisciplinary project, and probably a trickier one. I mean, in a way, you all are creating art, or it's already somewhat interdisciplinary because you're creating artistic projects through your creative tasks and your final projects. And when it comes to interdisciplinary CS, there's a billion, a lot of different intersections that you could choose. So if you wanted, I guess, not a super straightforward answer, but if you wanted a more direct answer, it would kind of depend on what particular project you would want to pursue that's interdisciplinary.
Yeah, right. There's a little discussion going on in the chat. It's great. Okay, here's another question. Let's see here, try and pick a good one. So I guess, how does, here's a question. Okay, yeah. So how does interdisciplinary work at CMU kind of happen? Like, what are the sort of the steps where like you get people working on these interdisciplinary projects, right? Like the RoboSnake that James brought up.
Yeah, I can talk a bit about that. So yeah, CMU's has a lot of interdisciplinary programs, and it kind of all starts from the research level. So a lot of professors will work on interdisciplinary topics, such as the snake robots, or in Tate's case, computational biology. So it's really driven by professors who are interested in those topics. And then a lot of them, you can participate in their research and work on those projects with them. And mostly, for the most part, in college, regardless of where you go, most places, professors are very welcoming of students who are looking to participate in research. So that's one way it's started. And then a lot of those professors also teach classes on those areas of interest that they're interested in. So for example, in the spring, I'm going to be taking a course on computational music, right? And that's taught by a professor who's interested in the topic and wants to share what they know about it. So yeah, I think it also, at least at CMU, there are a lot of classes you can take that explore these interdisciplinary issues and kind of these different intersections of these different topics.
Yeah, and I guess to also add on to that, there's the research and the coursework are definitely probably the biggest sources of being able to get yourself involved in interdisciplinary CS stuff. There's also some, there are also some clubs and organizations and events that you could participate in that have kind of an interdisciplinary focus. So if you all have ever heard of Hackathon, a hackathon is, broadly speaking, they give you whoever's in charge will give you some prompt to answer or some type of project to pursue, and you will, in most cases, either build some hardware or write a program or both in order to accomplish that problem. And so sometimes there are hackathons that are very interdisciplinary focused. Sometimes that might be to try and come up with an algorithmic solution to a big public health issue. There's also robotics hackathons, which I participated in one of, that involved kind of making battle bots, sort of. That was what I actually participated in that this fall. And so we got to, build and modify our own robots. And I got to modify some of the code that controlled how the robot moved around. And in addition to hackathons, organizations like, for example, there's a robotics club at CMU that handles all sorts of different robotics projects. I think they're working on lots of different things. Like, I think they've got like a submarine that they're working on, something called RoboSub. I think they've also got like, what is it? Like a drone, not a, I guess it's kind of like a drone, but it's supposed to be like a robotic, as far as I know, autonomous helicopter, or what looks like a, one of those flying drones. I think they call it quadcopter specifically, but they're handling all these interesting robotics hardware projects. And I'm trying to think, there's been even some like interaction between particular organizations. For a little while, I was a little bit informed about the data science club at CMU, and data science, just kind of broadly speaking, is how we can take really big data and use it to kind of condense it and present it in a way that's meaningful, which is kind of broad, but I would say like on a really high level, data science is like taking a bunch of data and either visualizing it so that you can find like trends, or using machine learning to make models, like I was talking about earlier with like natural language processing, for example, or even some computational biology stuff, and a bunch of other topics as well. Anyway, the Data Science Club interacted with, I believe it was one of the finance clubs on campus. And so they had like a weekend or a week where they had people talking about quantitative finance. And so they were talking about, how in the finance industry, where you have like stocks, and cryptocurrencies, and various other things, how computer science and data science in particular can intersect, and what you can use to complete or pursue finance projects that are kind of computer science oriented. And that's all based in things that are happening at CMU.
Yeah, there's also the ETC, which is a sort of section. It's not a college, but it's like a section of CMU, which does a bunch of, it's entertainment and technology. It's the Entertainment and Technology Center. And so it does a bunch of like that sort of VFX stuff that James was showing earlier. It does some of that, I believe, or looking into that. It also does a lot of VR type stuff. They've got some cool projects going on in there. There's a really fantastic question in the chat. Do you think the CMU professors have an interest in providing introductory bits of their lessons for middle school and high school? I don't know if either of you can answer this, but I can give some thoughts. I have a lot of thoughts on this.
I'll speak to that too. I think interest, yes. Time is what's real tricky. But we do have something that touches on this a little bit. If you go to the CMU CS Academy YouTube channel, which you're probably there right now if you're watching this, there is a series on our channel. I think they're called Scotty Scribbles. And those are all short little videos that our team has put together interviewing professors about some of the cool things that they're working on. I would say one of the things that could be difficult for some professors at CMU is to bring it down to a level that a middle schooler would understand. So that's kind of where I think our team plays a nice role when they get to work with them on that sort of stuff. But yeah, definitely reach out to us if there's interest in seeing more of those sorts of things. And we'll try to make them happen. And there's definitely people that want to do it. It's just how much time they have to make that happen.
Yeah, and there are professors that do a bunch of, like, we're working with an AI professor at CMU for our CS2 course. And he has run the last couple of years a middle school summer program to kind of talk about AI and just kind of get them into that topic a little bit. I know there's a professor, blanking on the name and what his project is called, but a while ago he did some like comp.io, basically putting up some intro questions on a site, I think, to sort of be like, here are some questions that you can answer in comp.io that are like kind of fundamental. And they're meant as like a get into the space a little bit and see what we do type thing. The founders of this project that like were working on a CS3 course, and it's basically, in effect, it's the intro course that Tate is a teaching assistant for high school students. And it's still, I think, somewhat of a complicated course for high school students because they're not trying to simplify it too much. They want it to be similar to the college version. But yeah, I think there's a lot of interest. I know there are professors in the math department who want to do stuff like this. But as Aaron says, there's a lot of time that goes into working on a project like that. And professors, the one thing they don't have a lot of is time. And so the interest is there. The ability to actually act on that interest is less there. Yes, Dave Turetsky does a lot of stuff as well in the K-12 space for AI. The AI professor I was talking about was Pat Prochi. I should really have a better memory for all these like projects that these professors do, but I, for the life of me, can never remember their names. Okay, I need to pull my questions back up. We'll do maybe one more question, and then okay. Here's a question which I don't really like the question necessarily, but I think it leads to some good conversation. So the question as written says, why do you think that computer science is important to know even if you don't work directly in computer science after your education? And I would like to start this question off by saying that the word important it's not important. I would say it's useful and it can lead to a lot of things, but you don't need to know it to survive, right? Say, James, do you have thoughts on this? Because I could talk about this for a while, but I'd like to give you the opportunity first.
Yeah, I think, I mean, nowadays everything has become so centered on computers, and nearly any field you go into, you're gonna find that it involves computers, and oftentimes it can be really helpful to understand programming, even if it's really basic stuff, like how to, let's say, for example, create formulas in Excel spreadsheet, right? Like that's a kind of programming. And it's useful in tons of fields like finance. And if you have that extra knowledge, right, it puts you at, puts you at a huge advantage, and it helps you work more efficiently and more effectively. So yeah, I really think just knowing at least like a basic level of programming is like, I would say it's like really useful and can actually really help you a lot in your career.
Yeah, I think I would say a lot of things along the same lines. While it's not necessarily vital, I think it is very useful to have programming skills, especially going into the future where technology and computers are only going to become more prevalent and more widely available and used in most fields of work. And so another one of the things, in addition to just the general programming skills that you get from computer science courses or taking at least one of them, is the ability to problem solve and reason logically about open-ended problems, because you have to, a lot of the times, solve a particular problem. You haven't been given any idea as to what steps you have to follow to solve it, or maybe you've been given some vague hints, but you still need to be able to recreate or create something yourself that might be pretty complex, that accomplishes some task. Or Maybe you've been given the the task of trying to make some thing run faster by automating it. Maybe recording. I'm trying to think. Trying to think of a specific example, but automating some task. And I think that being able to have the reasoning and the skills that you gain from a computer science course, even if you never touch a computer or if you never program, I think still introduces a different way of thinking and how to improve the efficiency of stuff that you do and the products that you create or the projects that you complete. I think it's very useful in that respect that you get that different way of thinking.
Yeah, and I think something about a lot of the conversation about this type of stuff tends to be around uses in like being able to get jobs that involve coding and stuff like that. But there's also a lot to be said for just having coding as a tool in your sort of like in your toolbox. Like it just adds to potential personal projects, hobbies that you have. Maybe sometime 10 years in the future, 20 years in the future, you think about like an application and you're like, oh, that would be really cool. If you don't know how to code, you're probably just going to give up and be like, no, that's way too much work to learn how to code, to learn a programming language. And then only then can I start to actually work on this thing that I think is cool. Whereas if you have some idea of how coding works, you can kind of get over that first hump, that first hurdle, and you makes it a lot easier to start projects like that. Like you want to make a game, you don't have to learn how to code. You know how for loops and variables work. So you can go and make your game and worry about the game things and not the coding things. And you might have to, depending on what you're doing, you might have to learn more about coding. For example, you might have to learn a new tool like Unity if you wanted to make a game. But you're just making it easier for yourself to get into this very big branch of possible projects if you learn how to code. I could go on and on, but I think we're just about at the end of our hour. There's one more question. Who hosts Rosalind, which is the platform that I put the link in the description? Let's see. I believe, if my information is not mistaken that I have here, it is a professor at CMU named Philip Campeau who wrote the Rosalind platform as a PhD student. Unfortunately, I don't know if he wrote it in conjunction with other people. I only have the email between him and us as we were trying to get information to get some feedback on our own CS2 computational biology stuff. So that's all the information I know. So if there's someone else, where's a good place to learn Unity? I do not have a great, I don't know. I know that there are YouTube tutorials and stuff. It's a fairly complicated program. It's got a pretty steep learning curve. And once you know how to use it, you can do a lot of really, really cool stuff. But for elementary school students, it's probably much more complicated than you need to get into. You can do it, anything an elementary student wants to do with, you can basically do in our platform, for example. Okay. I think that's going to end the stream for today. Thank you for thank you for joining us and asking your questions and the great discussion in the chat. Yeah. Have a great day.
Yep, thanks everyone. As Elliot mentioned earlier, we do have 2 more sessions coming up this week, actually 3. So keep an eye out on that list on our Twitter for those, and keep checking YouTube for more videos. Thanks.